The wind howled like a wounded beast, its freezing breath cutting through every layer of protection Saren had managed to scavenge. Her fingers, blue and numb, trembled as she adjusted the threadbare blanket around Ariel's tiny form. The child's face was pale, lips tinged with a faint blue that made Saren's heart clench with terror. His breaths came in shallow puffs, visible in the frigid air for mere seconds before dissolving into nothingness. "Stay with me, little one," she whispered, pressing her cracked lips against his forehead. The cold had stolen even the warmth of her breath, and she could barely feel the touch of her own skin against his. Just a little longer, but the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. A little longer for what? For the cold to claim them more slowly? For hunger to hollow them out completely before the freeze took mercy and finished what it had started? Saren squinted through the relentless snowfall, searching for anything that might resemble shelter. The landscape before her was an endless expanse of white, broken only by the occasional jagged formation of ice that jutted from the ground like the teeth of some ancient, forgotten beast. This planet, this frozen hell, had taken everything from her, and now it waited patiently to take the last two things she had left: her life and, more precious still, her son's. She stumbled forward, each step sinking her deeper into the snow that had already climbed past her knees. Every movement was agony, her muscles screaming in protest as she forced them to contract against the cold that wished to render them immobile. Ariel whimpered softly against her chest, the sound nearly lost in the howling wind. I know," she soothed, though her throat was raw from the cold air she had been breathing for days now. "Mama's going to find us somewhere warm." Another lie. There was no warmth on this planet. Not anymore. Memories of fire and blood flashed behind her eyes, the evacuation alarms blaring, the panic screams as the colony's power systems failed catastrophically, the hasty instructions to head for the emergency shelters, the realization, too late, that those shelters had been nothing more than a fantasy, a false comfort for colonists who were, in reality, expendable. Saren had grabbed Ariel and run when she understood the truth. Better to die trying than to wait like cattle in a slaughterhouse. But now, days later, with the colony far behind them and nothing ahead but ice and snow stretching to the horizon, she wondered if she had only prolonged their suffering. Her foot caught on something buried beneath the snow, and she fell forward, barely managing to twist her body to avoid crushing Ariel beneath her. The impact drove what little breath she had from her lungs, and for a moment she lay there, gasping, her face pressed into the snow, too exhausted to rise. "Mama," Ariel's voice was faint, frightened. "I'm okay," she lied again, forcing herself to her knees. Mama just tripped, but as she tried to stand, her legs refused to obey. The cold had seeped too deeply into her muscles, and now they rebelled against her will. She crawled instead, clutching Ariel to her chest with one arm, dragging herself forward with the other. Her fingers clawed at the snow, finding no purchase, leaving shallow furrows that were quickly erased by the falling snow. Night was coming. She could feel it in the changing quality of the light, the way the white world around her took on a bluish cast as the distant sun began to set. She had survived 3 nights in the open already, huddled in what shelter she could find, sharing her body heat with Ariel. But each morning, it had taken longer to force her frozen limbs to move, longer to rouse Ariel from the dangerous, deep sleep that the cold induced. They would not survive another night. She knew this with a certainty that settled in her bones alongside the cold. Just ahead, a dark shape loomed against the white. An outcropping of rock, perhaps, or one of the strange, twisted ice formations that dotted the landscape. It wasn't much, but might block the wind. It might give them a few more hours. Saren dragged herself toward it, leaving a trail of disturbed snow behind her that was quickly erased by fresh snowfall. By the time she reached the dark shape, the light had faded further, and she could barely make out its form, a jagged rock formation, jutting up from the snow at an angle that created a small, sheltered space beneath. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was all she had. She crawled into the space, pressing her back against the cold stone. The relief from the wind was immediate, if minimal. She adjusted Ariel in her arms, unwrapping him briefly to tuck him against her chest, skin to skin beneath her tattered thermal suit. Then she wrapped the blanket around them both, creating a tiny cocoon of what little heat her body still generated. "Mama, I'm cold," Ariel whispered his small hands, seeking warmth against her neck. "I know, baby," she said, abandoning the lies at last. "I know you are. Will we find Father tomorrow?" The question twisted in her heart like a knife. Ariel's father had been one of the first to die when the colony's environmental systems failed. He had been working near the main reactor when it went critical, trying desperately to stabilize it. Saren had never told Ariel the truth. How could she explain death to a child who had barely lived? "Maybe," she said softly, stroking his hair. "Close your eyes now. Try to sleep. Will you sing the star song?" he asked, his voice already fading. Saren swallowed hard, fighting back tears that would only freeze on her cheeks. "All the stars are watching," she sang, her voice a broken whisper in the gathering darkness. "All the stars are bright. They'll keep you safe and warm, my love, throughout the longest night." Ariel's breathing deepened, and she felt his small body grow heavier against hers as he slipped into sleep. She continued to sing, though there was no one left to hear, the words catching in her throat as exhaustion and cold worked their inevitable way through her defenses. She knew what was happening. Her body was shutting down, preserving what heat it could for its core functions. Soon, even those would fail. She would slip into unconsciousness, and then the cold would take her, and Ariel with her. In that moment, a strange peace settled over her. She had done everything she could. She had run until she could no longer stand. She had carried Ariel until her arms had nearly given out. She had kept him alive for 3 days in conditions that should have killed them both within hours. It would end here, but they would be together. She would hold him until the very end, giving him every last bit of warmth her body could generate. Perhaps, if there was mercy in the universe, they would find Ariel's father in whatever came after. "I love you," she whispered to her son, wrapping her arms more tightly around his small form. "More than all the stars." She closed her eyes, feeling the cold creep further inward, numbing her thoughts as it had already numbed her limbs. The wind continued to howl outside their meager shelter, but seemed distant now, unimportant. There was only Ariel's weight against her chest, the slow rhythm of his breathing, the knowledge that soon, very soon, both would cease. Saren let go, surrendering to the inevitable, allowing the darkness to take her. But death did not come. Instead, warmth. At first, it was so faint that Saren thought she must be imagining it, some final hallucination as her brain shut down. But it persisted, growing stronger, a gentle heat against her back where there had been only cold stone before. And then movement, the sensation of being lifted, carried. Consciousness flickered like a faulty light, giving her brief, disconnected glimpses of reality. Dark walls, artificial light, harsh after days in the diffused brightness of snow. Hands, strong but gentle, unwrapping the blanket, checking Ariel with practiced movements. A voice, deep and quiet, speaking words she couldn't quite grasp. She fought against the darkness, desperate to protect Ariel, but her body refused to respond. She could only watch through half-lidded eyes as a figure moved around what seemed to be a small, cramped space, gathering items, preparing something at a makeshift stove. And then blessed, wonderful heat, a warm liquid trickling between her lips, sliding down her throat, spreading through her chest like fire. She coughed weakly, and the movement sent pain lancing through her frozen muscles. "Easy," said the voice, clearer now. "Small sips. Male. Adult. Unfamiliar. Threat?" Her mind tried to process, to categorize, but confusion clouded her thoughts. She forced her eyes to focus, to find Ariel. There, wrapped in what looked like thermal blankets, proper ones, not the threadbare covering she had scavenged. His color was better already, the dangerous blue tinge fading from his lips. A small tube ran from his arm to a clear bag of fluid suspended above him. "He'll be okay," said the voice, as if reading her thoughts. "Mild hypothermia, dehydration, nothing that can't be fixed." Saren's eyes moved to the source of the voice. A man knelt beside her, his features difficult to make out through her blurred vision. Broad shoulders, dark hair, a face weathered by cold and time. "Ariel," she managed to croak, her voice barely audible. "Your son is fighting," the man said, his tone reassuring but not patronizing. "He's strong, like his mother." Saren tried to reach for Ariel, but her arms remained unresponsive, heavy as stone. "Don't try to move yet," the man advised. "Your body temperature is still too low. Give it time." "Oh," she began but started coughing again. The man waited patiently for the spasm to pass before answering the unfinished question. "Miles," he said simply. "Former colony security." He paused, then added, "I got out before the collapse. Been surviving on my own. Until now, I guess." Survival instinct warred with desperate gratitude in Saren's mind. This man had saved them, pulled them from the edge of death. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when Ariel's safety was at stake. As if sensing her thoughts, Miles moved away, giving her space. "Rest," he said. "We can talk when you're stronger." Despite her suspicion, exhaustion pulled at Saren with irresistible force. The warmth, the relative safety, the absence of the biting wind, all conspired to lower her defenses. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she found herself drifting, her last conscious thought a prayer that Ariel would still be there when she woke. She dreamed of fire and ice, of running through endless corridors that twisted and turned and led nowhere. She dreamed of Ariel slipping from her grasp, falling into a darkness that had no bottom. She dreamed of hands reaching for her, some helping, some grasping, some with intent to harm. When she woke, the small space was dimly lit. It took her eyes a moment to adjust, to make sense of her surroundings. She was in what appeared to be a shelter of some kind, constructed partially from salvaged materials and partially from the natural rock formations of the planet. A heat source hummed quietly in one corner, some kind of generator, she guessed, likely scavenged from colony equipment. And there, still wrapped in thermal blankets, but now sitting up, looking pale but alert, was Ariel. Relief flooded through her with such force that for a moment she couldn't breathe. "Mama!" he exclaimed when he saw her eyes open. "The man made soup. It's hot." Saren tried to sit up, finding that while her body still ached, her muscles now responded to her commands. She looked around warily for their rescuer. Miles sat on what looked like a crate on the far side of the shelter, giving them space. When he saw her gaze fall on him, he nodded once in acknowledgement but didn't approach. "How long?" Saren asked, her voice still rough. 18 hours, Miles replied. "You needed it. 18 hours. She had been unconscious for 18 hours, completely vulnerable, completely at this stranger's mercy. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Thank you," she said stiffly, because regardless of her suspicions, this man had saved their lives. "For finding us." Miles shrugged, a simple lifting of those broad shoulders. Anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true. In the chaos after the colony's collapse, she had seen the worst of humanity. People trampling others in their rush to escape, hoarding supplies, threatening violence to protect what little they had. Kindness had become as rare as warmth on this frozen world. "How did you find us?" she asked, slowly shifting to sit closer to Ariel, who immediately leaned against her side. "I was tracking a herd of ice grazers," Miles explained. "They're about the only food source left out there. Saw your tracks cutting across the herd's path. Followed them." He didn't elaborate on why he had chosen to follow the tracks rather than continue his hunt, and Saren didn't ask. Instead, she looked around the shelter, taking in the sparse but carefully organized supplies, the efficient use of space, the signs of long-term habitation. "You've been here a while," she observed. Miles nodded. "Almost a year, since just before the colony went dark." "You knew it was coming," Saren said, not a question but an accusation. Something flickered across Miles's face. Regret, perhaps, or guilt. Y had suspicions. The corporation was cutting corners on maintenance, ignoring warning signs. When they started reducing security personnel, I knew they were preparing to abandon the operation. I tried to warn people, but he trailed off, his jaw tightening. No one wanted to believe it. Saren remembered the whispers, the rumors that had circulated through the colony in its final weeks. She had dismissed them as fear-mongering, as her husband had, trusting in the corporation's promises that everything was under control. The memory of her naivety tasted like ash in her mouth. "There's soup," Miles said, changing the subject. "If you feel up to it." Saren's stomach clenched at the mention of food, reminding her that it had been days since she'd eaten anything substantial. "Please," she said. Miles moved to the small stove in the corner, ladling something from a pot into a battered metal cup. The smell that wafted toward her as he approached made her mouth water, some kind of meat broth, rich and savory. He handed her the cup, then retreated again to his side of the shelter. "It's ice grazer," he explained. "Not exactly gourmet, but it's high in fat and protein. Good for recovering from cold exposure." Saren sipped cautiously, the warm liquid spreading through her chest. It tasted better than anything she could remember. Eating, though she knew that was probably just her body's desperate need for sustenance. She shared the cup with Ariel, making sure he drank slowly. "The white animals?" Ariel asked, looking at Miles with curiosity rather than fear. "The ones with the funny horns?" Miles nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "That's right. They use them to dig through the ice for the lichen that grows underneath." Ariel seemed fascinated by this information, his natural childish inquisitiveness temporarily overriding the trauma of the past days. "Do they have babies?" "They do," Miles confirmed. "Little ones, born in the spring when the ice thins a bit." "Like me?" Ariel asked, and Saren felt her heart constrict at the innocent question. Something softened in Miles's expression. "A bit smaller than you," he said, "but just as curious, I'd bet." The conversation lapsed into silence after that, the only sounds the soft humming of the generator and the occasional howl of wind outside. Saren finished the soup, feeling strength slowly returning to her limbs. "What now?" she finally asked, voicing the question that hung in the air between them. Miles met her gaze directly. "That's up to you," he said. "You and your son are welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel. After that," he shrugged again, "there's not much out there. The colony is completely dark now. No survivors that I've found. There's an emergency transmitter at what used to be the northern outpost, about 100 kilometers from here. It was still working last time I checked, broadcasting an automated distress signal. But no one's come." The bleak assessment hung in the air. Saren pulled Ariel closer to her side, trying to process their options. 100 kilometers might as well be a million in these conditions, especially with a child. But staying meant depending on the generosity of a stranger, one whose resources were clearly limited. "We won't be a burden," she said finally, her pride warring with practicality. "I can help hunt, or whatever else needs doing." Miles nodded, accepting her decision without comment. "You should rest more," he said. "Both of you. We can figure out the details later." Saren wanted to protest that she had rested enough, that she needed to start pulling her weight immediately, but exhaustion was already tugging at her again, her body demanding more recovery time. She lay back down, Ariel curling against her side. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling inadequate. Miles merely nodded once more, then turned his attention to maintaining the small stove, his back to them in a gesture that might have been meant to provide privacy or to signal the end of the conversation. Saren watched him for a moment longer, trying to gauge his intentions, to decipher the puzzle of a man who would track strangers through a blizzard and bring them into his shelter with no apparent expectation of return. She found no answers in his stoic profile, only more questions. But as sleep claimed her once more, one thought remained clear. For now, at least, they were alive. And in this frozen wasteland, survival for one more day was the only victory that mattered. The next few days established a cautious routine. Saren recovered her strength more quickly than she had expected. The combination of proper rest, warmth, and regular meals working what seemed like miracles on her frostbitten body. Ariel, with the resilience of the very young, bounced back even faster, his cheeks regaining their color, his energy returning in bursts that made the small shelter seem suddenly smaller. Miles kept his distance, physically and emotionally. He was unfailingly polite, patient with Ariel's endless questions, and respectful of the boundaries Saren established. But he volunteered little about himself, responding to direct questions with minimal information and deflecting any attempt at deeper conversation. Saren learned that he had been part of the colony's security team for 3 years before its collapse, that he had military training before that, though he didn't specify what kind or where, that he had no family, either on this planet or elsewhere. Each fact was delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone, with no elaboration, no emotion to hint at the person behind the data. True to her word, Saren insisted on contributing as soon as she was able. She took over the preparation of meals, making the most of the limited supplies. She repaired tears and clothing, organized the chaotic medical supplies, and cleaned the small living space until it was as orderly as its cramped conditions would allow. Miles accepted her help without comment, simply adjusting to her presence in what had clearly been a solitary existence for some time. He continued his daily routine, checking the perimeter of the shelter, maintaining the generator, hunting when supplies ran low. Sometimes he would be gone for hours, returning with ice grazer meat or occasionally other scavenged items from abandoned outposts. Ariel, naturally gregarious and starved for interaction after days of terror and pain, attached himself to Miles with the single-minded determination of a child who has decided someone is their friend. He followed the man around the shelter, asking questions about everything from ice grazers to the generator to the stars visible through the small viewport in the shelter's roof. To Saren's surprise, Miles answered each question with patience, occasionally even elaborating beyond the minimum information. He showed Ariel how to identify different constellations, explained how the generator converted fuel into heat and power, demonstrated the proper way to mend tears in the thermal blankets. It was during one of these impromptu lessons, as Miles showed Ariel how to check the charge level on a portable heater, that Saren first saw something beyond the stoic mask the man presented to the world. A flash of genuine warmth in his eyes, a softening around his mouth that might, in another life, have been a smile. The sight caused an unexpected tightness in her chest. This man had saved them, housed them, fed them, asked for nothing in return. And yet she still maintained her guard, still watched him with suspicion, still slept with one eye open despite her exhaustion. That night, as Ariel slept soundly in the small sleeping area Miles had constructed for him, Saren sat by the stove, watching the play of light and shadow on the shelter's walls. Miles was outside, performing his nightly check of the perimeter, a routine he never skipped, regardless of weather or fatigue. When he returned, stomping snow from his boots at the entrance, she made her decision. "My husband was an engineer," she said without preamble as Miles hung his heavy outer garment on a hook by the door. He worked in the Environmental Control Center. When the system started failing, he stayed behind to try to stabilize the main reactor while I evacuated with Ariel. We both thought, that the emergency protocols would work, that we'd all meet at the shelters. She swallowed hard. There were no shelters, just locked doors and darkness. Miles paused in the act of removing his gloves, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I know," he said quietly. "I found similar conditions at the northern outpost. False hope, designed to prevent panic while the corporate leadership made their escape." Saren nodded, a bitter taste filling her mouth at the confirmation of what she had already known. When I realized the truth, I just ran. Grabbed whatever supplies I could carry and ran. I thought maybe if we could reach one of the outlying research stations. She trailed off, the futility of her plan now obvious in retrospect. "A reasonable strategy," Miles said, surprising her. The research stations were more self-sufficient than the main colony. Some might have survived the initial collapse. But not for long, Saren guessed. Miles shook his head. No, not for long. Silence fell between them, but it felt different now. Less guarded, more shared. Saren had offered a piece of herself, and Miles had accepted it without judgment. "I was stationed at the Northern Security Outpost," he said after a moment, moving to sit on a crate across from her. "We were the first to notice the pattern of supply shortages, equipment failures, things that could be dismissed individually as normal operational issues, but together," he exhaled slowly. "Together, they told a story. The corporation was pulling out quietly, gradually, removing essential personnel, redirecting supply ships, shutting down non-essential systems. And you tried to warn people," Saren said, remembering what he had told her before. Miles nodded, his gaze fixed on the stove's glow. "I filed reports, spoke to my superior officers, even tried to contact the governor directly. But the corporation's influence was too strong. Anyone who listened was removed, reassigned off-world. The rest were kept in the dark." "So you left," Saren said, and there was no accusation in her tone now, only understanding. "I made a choice," Miles corrected, meeting her gaze. "Stay and die with the colony, or leave and try to save at least some of the people I'd sworn to protect. I thought if I could establish a base, gather supplies, create a safe haven." He gestured around the small shelter. "This was supposed to be temporary, a first step, but by the time I had it secure, the colony was already in full collapse. The evacuation was chaotic, violent. I tried to direct survivors here, but most ignored me, heading for the false promise of the emergency shelters. Those who did listen," he paused. "They didn't all make it through the first winter." The implication hung in the air between them. Miles had not been alone all this time. There had been others, survivors like her and Ariel, who had found temporary refuge here. But the planet had claimed them, one by one, until only Miles remained. "I'm sorry," Saren said softly. Miles acknowledged her sympathy with a slight inclination of his head. "You're the first survivors I've found in almost 3 months," he said. I had begun to think there was no one left. The admission seemed to cost him something, a brief crack appearing in his stoic facade. Saren found herself wanting to reach across the space between them, to offer some gesture of comfort or connection. Instead, she wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of the precariousness of their situation. "Will we survive the winter?" she asked bluntly. Miles considered the question, respect for her directness evident in his expression. "It will be difficult," he said honestly. "Supplies are limited. The generator requires fuel that's becoming harder to find. Game is scarce." He paused. "But it's possible, especially now. Because there are 3 of us," Saren said, understanding his meaning. 3 people to share the work, to watch for danger, to keep this shelter running." "Yes," Miles agreed. "And because you and Ariel give me a reason to try harder." The simple statement, delivered without drama or expectation, caught Saren off guard. She looked at Miles, really looked at him for the first time since their rescue. The lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. The careful way he held himself, as if bearing a weight he had carried for too long alone. The steadiness of his gaze, direct and honest. "We'll help," she said firmly. "Not just with the shelter, with everything. Ariel is young, but he's strong and smart. And I won't give up. Not again." "I know," Miles said, and for the first time since she had met him, something almost like a smile touched his lips. "I saw that when I found you in the snow. Anyone else would have been dead. But you were still trying to keep your son warm, still fighting even when your body had nothing left to give." The memory of that moment, the cold, the despair, the certainty of death, sent a shudder through Saren. "I thought we were going to die," she admitted. "I had accepted it. But you didn't stop trying," Miles pointed out. "That's the difference." Their conversation was interrupted by a small voice from the sleeping area. "Mama." Saren rose immediately, moving to Ariel's side. "I'm here, baby. I had a bad dream," Ariel murmured, his eyes heavy with sleep. The cold was coming back. "It's okay," Saren soothed, brushing his hair from his forehead. "We're safe here. The cold can't get us." "Promise?" Ariel asked, already drifting back toward sleep. "I promise," Saren said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. For the first time since the colony's collapse, she felt a flicker of genuine hope. Not just for survival, but for something more, a life, however hard, however different from what she had planned. She glanced back at Miles, who had respectfully turned his attention to checking the generator, giving her an aerial privacy. In profile, illuminated by the stove's glow, he looked solid, dependable, a fixed point in a world that had dissolved into chaos. Perhaps, Saren thought as she settled beside her son, they had found more than just shelter from the cold. The relative peace of their new routine was shattered 3 weeks later. It began with a sound, distant at first, barely distinguishable from the constant howl of the wind that had become the backdrop to their existence. But it grew louder, more insistent, until even Ariel paused in his play to listen. "What is that?" Saren asked, looking up from the torn thermal suit she was mending. Miles was already moving toward the shelter's entrance, his body tense with alertness. "Engines," he said, reaching for the heavy coat that hung by the door. "Stay here. Both of you." "Wait," Saren said, rising quickly. "It could be rescue. It could be anything." Miles cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "And until we know what, you and Ariel stay hidden." He slipped outside before she could protest further, sealing the entrance behind him. Saren stood frozen for a moment, torn between hope and fear. Engines meant technology, power, the possibility of escape from this frozen world. But it also meant unknown intentions, potential threat to the fragile safety they had established. "Mama," Ariel's voice was small, uncertain. "Are the bad people coming back?" Saren moved to his side, pulling him close. "I don't know, baby," she said honestly, "but Miles will protect us. And so will I." She guided Ariel to the small alcove Miles had shown them during their first week at the shelter, a hidden space behind a panel of salvaged metal, originally designed to store emergency supplies, but now emptied to serve as a potential hiding place. Saren helped Ariel inside, then hesitated, torn between staying with him and going to help Miles. "Stay here," she told her son, making her decision. "Don't come out until I or Miles come for you. Understand?" Ariel nodded solemnly, his eyes wide with fear but trusting. Saren sealed the panel, making sure it was secure before moving toward the entrance. She grabbed one of the tools Miles used for hunting, a long, sharpened piece of metal that served as a makeshift spear, and slipped outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath despite the thermal suit she now wore. She squinted against the brightness of the snow, searching for Miles. She spotted him crouched behind a rock formation about 50 meters from the shelter, his attention fixed on something in the distance. Saren moved toward him, keeping low as he was doing, the spear clutched in her gloved hand. Miles turned at her approach, his expression hardening when he saw her. "I told you to stay inside," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Ariel is hidden," Saren replied, refusing to be cowed. "What is it?" Miles gestured toward the horizon. "See for yourself." Saren followed his gaze, and her heart stuttered in her chest. A vehicle of some kind was making its way across the snow, a large, bulky transport with treads instead of wheels, designed for traversing the difficult terrain. It flew no flag, bore no insignia that she could see, but sleek design and obvious technological sophistication marked it as corporate in origin. "The company," she whispered, dread pooling in her stomach. "After all this time, scavengers, more likely," Miles said grimly, "looking for anything of value left behind. Technology, data, resources. Will they find a shelter?" Miles shook his head. "Not if they're just passing through. I built it to be invisible from more than a few meters away." He hesitated, then added, "But if they're using thermal imaging," he didn't need to finish the thought. The generator that kept them alive would be a beacon to anyone looking for heat signatures in this frozen wasteland. "What do we do?" Saren asked, grip tightening on the spear. Miles studied the approaching vehicle, his expression calculating. "We wait," he decided. "See if they pass by. If they don't." He glanced at her, his eyes meeting hers directly. "If they find us, let me handle it. These types, they're not here to help. They're here to take. And they won't think twice about eliminating what they see as competition for limited resources." The cold certainty in his voice sent a shiver through Saren that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had seen the aftermath of the colony's collapse, the desperate violence of people fighting for survival. But she had never had to face it directly, had always managed to stay one step ahead of the worst human behaviors. "I won't let them hurt Ariel," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. Miles looked at her for a long moment, something like respect dawning in his eyes. "I know," he said simply. Then, more quietly, "I won't either." They watched in tense silence as the vehicle continued its approach. It wasn't heading directly for the shelter, Saren noted with relief, but rather seemed to be following a path perpendicular to their position. If it maintained its course, it would pass about a kilometer to the east, close enough to be a concern, but perhaps not close enough to detect them. But as they watched, the vehicle suddenly changed direction, veering toward them with deliberate purpose. "They've seen something," Miles said, his voice tight. "Get back to the shelter. Now." Saren hesitated, reluctant to leave him alone to face whatever was coming. "Miles, go," he insisted. "Ariel needs you. I'll handle this." The mention of her son decided her. Saren nodded once, then turned and ran back toward the shelter, staying low to present as small a target as possible against the white landscape. She slipped inside, quickly sealing the entrance behind her. "Ariel," she called softly, moving to the hidden panel. "Mama." His voice was muffled but steady. "Stay where you are, baby," she instructed. "Just a little longer." She moved to the small viewport, peering out anxiously. The vehicle had stopped about 200 meters from the shelter, its massive bulk casting a long shadow across the snow. A hatch opened in its side, and figures emerged, 3 of them, heavily bundled against the cold, their faces obscured by protective masks. They carried weapons. Even from this distance, Saren could see the distinctive shape of assault rifles slung across their chests. Not scavengers, then, or not only scavengers. These were people prepared for violence, expecting resistance. Miles stood his ground as they approached, his posture relaxed but alert. Saren could see his mouth moving, could imagine the calm, measured tone he would be using to assess the situation, to defuse potential conflict. One of the strangers gestured toward the shelter, clearly having detected its presence despite Miles's careful concealment. For a moment, it seemed as though the conversation might remain peaceful. The strangers lowered their weapons slightly, their body language becoming less aggressive. Miles nodded, responding to something they had said. He even turned, as if to lead them toward the shelter. Then, without warning, one of the strangers raised his weapon. Saren's scream caught in her throat as she saw Miles dive to the side, rolling through the snow as a burst of gunfire erupted. He came up with his own weapon, a sidearm Saren hadn't known he possessed, and returned fire in one fluid motion. One of the strangers fell, scarlet blooming against the white snow. The others scattered, seeking cover behind the rocky outcroppings that dotted the landscape. Miles did the same, disappearing from Saren's view behind a formation to the west of the shelter. For several agonizing minutes, there was nothing but sporadic gunfire and the howl of the wind. Saren clutched the spear, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it must be audible even through the shelter's walls. She positioned herself between the entrance and Ariel's hiding place, prepared to defend her son with her life if necessary. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Silence stretched, broken only by the wind and the distant hum of the vehicle's engines. Saren strained to see through the viewport, desperate for any sign of Miles, but the angle was wrong, the visibility too limited. The shelter's entrance hissed open, and Saren raised the spear, every muscle tense for action. Miles stumbled inside, clutching his side, his face pale beneath the windburn. Relief flooded through Saren, quickly followed by alarm as she saw the dark stains spreading across his thermal suit. "You're hurt," she said, dropping the spear and moving to help him. "It's not bad," Miles grunted, allowing her to guide him to a sitting position. "Grazed me. The others are dead." "Dead," Saren repeated, the word feeling strange on her tongue. It shouldn't have been shocking. Death had become commonplace in this harsh new reality, but the immediacy of it, the violence, struck her anew. Miles nodded grimly. They were Cerberus security. Corporate mercenaries. They wanted the shelter, the supplies. He winced as Saren helped him remove the thermal suit to expose the wound. Said they'd let us live if we surrendered everything. They were lying. Saren didn't ask how he knew they were lying. She had seen enough in the past months to understand that some promises couldn't be trusted, especially from those who arrived with weapons raised. Ariel, she called, moving to the hidden panel. You can come out now. It's safe. The panel slid aside, and Ariel emerged, his eyes widening when he saw Miles. You're bleeding, he exclaimed, his voice high with fear. Just a scratch, Miles assured him, managing a tight smile. Nothing your mother can't fix. Saren wasn't so sure. The wound looked deep, still seeping blood despite the pressure Miles was applying, but she appreciated his effort to calm Ariel. Get the medical kit, she instructed her son, giving him a task to focus on. As Ariel scurried to fetch the supplies, Saren examined the wound more closely. It needs cleaning and stitches, she said, trying to recall the basic medical training all colonists had received. This will hurt. Miles nodded, accepting the assessment without complaint. Do what you need to do. Saren worked methodically, cleaning the wound with the limited antiseptic they had, then carefully suturing it closed with the medical thread from the kit. Miles remained stoic throughout the procedure, his only reaction an occasional tightening of his jaw or sharp intake of breath when the pain was particularly intense. Ariel watched with solemn attention, handing Saren items as she needed them, his initial fear giving way to a child's fascination with the process. Will it leave a scar? He asked Miles, his tone suggesting that such an outcome would be impressive rather than concerning. Probably, Miles replied, his voice strained but steady. To go with all the others. It was only then that Saren truly noticed the other scars that marked Miles's torso, some old and faded, others more recent, all telling the story of a life lived on the edge of survival. She finished the final stitch, then covered the wound with a clean dressing from a kit. Thank you, Miles said quietly as she helped him into a clean shirt. Saren nodded, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. Her hands on his skin, his trust in her care, Ariel's simple acceptance of both. They had moved beyond mere survival partners, beyond the cautious alliance of the first weeks. Something more had formed between them, something she wasn't yet ready to name. The vehicle, she said, changing the subject. Could we use it? Miles considered the question, understanding its importance. Maybe, he said cautiously, if it's not too damaged from the firefight. If the fuel cells are compatible with the ones I'm familiar with. He glanced at Ariel, who had returned to his plane now that the excitement was over. It would make reaching the northern outpost possible. The transmitter there is stronger than any portable unit. If there's anyone left to hear it, then we have to try, Saren said firmly. Not just for us, but for Ariel. He deserves more than this. A future beyond just surviving day to day. Miles was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting between Saren and Ariel. You're right, he said finally, but not today. The wound needs time to heal, and we need to be sure the area is secure. If there was one team of scavengers, there could be others, Saren finished, understanding the implication. We'll wait. Prepare. Make sure we're ready when the time comes. Miles nodded, relief evident in his expression, not just at her understanding, she realized, but at the use of we. The acknowledgement that whatever came next, they would face it together. Get some rest, she told him, her tone brooking no argument. I'll keep watch. Miles looked as though he might protest, but then relented, perhaps recognizing his own limitations. Wake me in 4 hours, he said, making it a request rather than a command. Saren agreed, though she had no intention of waking him until he had rested properly. She helped him to his sleeping area, then moved to the viewport to begin her vigil. Behind her, Ariel had abandoned his play and curled up next to Miles, his small form pressed against the man's uninjured side. Miles seemed startled by this for a moment, then carefully placed an arm around the boy, a protective gesture that made Saren's heart constrict with an emotion she wasn't ready to examine. She turned her attention back to the viewport, to the hostile world beyond their fragile shelter. Whatever bond was forming between them, whatever future might be possible, They had to survive the present first. And that would require all the strength, courage, and unity they could muster. The weeks that followed tested that unity in ways Saren could never have anticipated. Miles's wound, initially healing well, developed an infection. For 3 terrifying days, he burned with fever, slipping in and out of consciousness, murmuring disjointed phrases that hinted at past trauma Saren could only guess at. She used the last of their antibiotics, applying cool compresses to his forehead, forcing fluid between his cracked lips, praying to God she had long since stopped believing in. Ariel refused to leave Miles's side, his small face solemn with a child's understanding of mortality. "He can't die," he told Saren with absolute conviction. "He promised to teach me how to hunt." Saren didn't have the heart to tell her son that promises meant little in the face of infection and limited medical supplies. Instead, she enlisted his help, giving him simple tasks, fetching water, talking to Miles even when the man couldn't respond, monitoring the generator's fuel level. The responsibilities seemed to steady him, to give him purpose amid the uncertainty. On the 4th day, Miles's fever broke. He opened his eyes, clear and lucid for the first time in days, to find Saren dozing in a chair beside him, Ariel curled against his side, as had become the child's habit. "You look terrible," he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. Saren startled awake, relief washing over her in a wave so powerful it left her trembling. "You're one to talk," she retorted, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of ice grazers," Miles admitted, wincing as he tried to shift position. "How long was I out?" "Almost 4 days," Saren told him, helping him take a sip of water. "The wound got infected. I wasn't sure." She trailed off, unwilling to voice the fear that had kept her awake through those long nights. Miles's hand found hers, his grip weak, but steady. "Thank you," he said simply. The touch, the gratitude, both were unexpected, and Saren found herself blinking back sudden tears. She had come so close to losing him, this man who had saved them, who had become essential to their survival in ways that went beyond the practical. Ariel stirred then, his eyes widening when he saw Miles awake. "You're better," he exclaimed, throwing his arms around the man's neck with a child's unself-conscious affection. Miles winced at the impact, but returned the embrace awkwardly, his gaze meeting Saren's over Ariel's head. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite decipher. Wonder, perhaps, or a kind of bewildered gratitude at finding himself the object of such concern, such care. "I promised, didn't I?" he said to Ariel, his voice gruff with emotion. Ariel nodded solemnly. "You said you'd teach me to hunt, and that we'd fix the big machine together. And we will," Miles assured him, "as soon as I'm back on my feet." The recovery was slow, frustrating for a man accustomed to independence and constant movement. Saren found herself in the unfamiliar position of authority, making decisions about hunting trips, resource allocation, security measures. Miles offered guidance when asked but seemed content to let her take the lead, watching with what might have been approval as she grew more confident in her new role. By the time he was well enough to resume his normal activities, the dynamics between them had shifted once again. They had become a unit, a family of sorts, each with defined roles that complemented the others. Miles still handled most of the hunting and security, but now he took Ariel with him on shorter excursions, teaching the boy the skills he would need to survive in this harsh world. Saren managed the shelter, but also began to accompany Miles on more dangerous missions, proving herself a quick study with both weapons and survival techniques. And through it all, their plan evolved. The mercenaries' vehicle, damaged but reparable, became the focus of their efforts. Miles and Saren worked on it whenever weather permitted, scavenging parts from abandoned outposts, adapting systems, stockpiling fuel. Ariel helped in his way, holding tools, asking questions that sometimes led to unexpected solutions, his natural curiosity a constant reminder of why they needed to succeed. "Do you really think anyone will hear the signal?" Saren asked one night as they sat by the stove, Ariel already asleep in his alcove. "It's been almost a year since the colony fell. If anyone was coming, They would have come by now, Miles finished, acknowledging the doubt they both shared but rarely voiced. Maybe, but the northern outpost transmitter is powerful enough to reach the main shipping lanes. If we boost its signal with the components from the mercenaries' communication system, we might reach someone who doesn't even know this planet exists. And if we do, Saren pressed, voicing the question that had been weighing on her mind. What then? Return to the corporation that abandoned us? Face whatever consequences they've designed for survivors who might expose their negligence? Miles was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the stove's flickering light. There are other options, he said finally. Independent colonies. Frontier settlements that would value people with our experience. Places where Ariel could have something resembling a normal childhood. The mention of her son's future struck Saren with unexpected force. In the daily struggle for survival, she had pushed aside thoughts of what might come after, if there was an after. But now, looking at Miles, she allowed herself to imagine it. A place where Ariel could play without fear, learn without the constant threat of death, grow into adulthood surrounded by more than just ice and desolation. And us, she asked softly, the question hanging in the air between them. What would we be in this hypothetical future? Miles met her gaze, something vulnerable in his expression that she had never seen before. Whatever you want us to be, he said, his voice low and serious. I've learned not to plan too far ahead, not to expect too much. But if we make it off this planet, he hesitated, seeming to search for words. I'd like to find out what we could be away from all this. If you would. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a promise. But in that moment, it felt like the most honest, most hopeful thing anyone had ever said to her. Saren found herself moving closer to him, drawn by something stronger than the practical alliance that had sustained them thus far. I like that too, she said, her hand finding his in the dim light. He laced his fingers through hers, the gesture intimate despite the layers of calluses and scars that marked both their hands. They sat like that in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance behind the stove's grate, allowing themselves, just for a moment, to believe in a future beyond survival. The blizzard struck without warning 2 days later, descending on them with a fury that seemed almost personal. The wind shrieked like a living thing, driving snow and ice against the shelter with such force that Saren feared the structure might collapse around them. The temperature plummeted, forcing them to huddle around the stove, conserving the generator's fuel for fear of running out before the storm passed. How long will it last? Saren asked on the second day, watching as Miles carefully measured out their dwindling food supplies. Hard to say, he replied, his expression grim. The worst storms I've seen here lasted a week. Some longer. Ariel, restless from confinement, pressed his face against the viewport, though there was nothing to see but swirling white. Can we still go to the big machine when it stops? He asked, referring to the transmitter at the northern outpost, which had taken on almost mythical proportions in his imagination. That's the plan, Miles assured him, though he exchanged a worried glance with Saren over the boy's head. If the storm continued too long, they might not have enough supplies for the journey, even with the vehicle. By the third day, the howling of the wind had taken on a new, more alarming note. Miles spent hours examining the shelter's structure, reinforcing weak points, patching small leaks that had developed where the cold had warped the materials. We need to be ready to move if necessary, he told Saren quietly while Ariel slept. If the shelter's integrity fails. He didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what it would mean to be exposed to the full force of the blizzard. Death would come quickly, but not quickly enough. Where would we go? Saren asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. The vehicle isn't ready yet. There's a secondary shelter, Miles said, about 2 kilometers east. It's smaller, less equipped, but it's built into the rock face. More stable. I set it up as a backup during the first winter. You never mentioned it before, Saren noted, not accusatory but curious. Miles shrugged. Never needed to. And it's not much, barely room for 1 person, let alone 3. But if it comes to it, the decision was made for them on the 4th day when a section of the shelter's roof caved in under the weight of accumulated ice, sending a cascade of snow and freezing air into their living space. Miles moved with practiced efficiency, sealing off the damaged section, but the damage had been done. The generator struggled to maintain even minimal heating with such a significant breach. "We have to go," he said, the urgency in his voice brooking no argument. "Now, while there's still enough light to find our way." Sarah nodded, already gathering the essentials: the emergency medical kit, what remained of their food, the portable heater that had been a backup power source. Ariel, sensing the gravity of the situation, helped without complaint, his small face solemn, with understanding beyond his years. "It will be very cold outside," Miles told the boy, helping him into the heaviest thermal suit they had, which still hung loose on his small frame. "We'll tie ourselves together so we don't get separated. You stay between your mother and me. Don't let go no matter what. Understand?" Ariel nodded, fear evident in his eyes but determination there as well. "I won't let go," he promised. The moment they stepped outside, Saren understood why Miles had been so insistent on leaving immediately. The blizzard was unlike anything she had experienced before, a wall of white so dense she could barely see Miles even though he stood less than a meter away. The cold cut through their thermal suits with terrifying ease, and the wind was so strong she had to struggle to remain upright. Miles secured the rope around each of them, tying it with double knots that wouldn't come loose even if their numbed fingers failed them. He took the lead, Ariel in the middle, Saren bringing up the rear. They moved slowly, fighting for each step against the wind and snow. Time lost all meaning in the white void. It might have been minutes or hours that they struggled forward, following Miles's unerring sense of direction. Saren focused solely on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping the rope taut between her and Ariel, on ignoring the burning of her lungs and the numbness spreading from her extremities inward. And then, suddenly, the resistance of the wind lessened. Saren blinked, trying to clear her vision as Miles guided them into what appeared to be a narrow crevice in the rock face. The storm still raged outside, but here, sheltered by the natural formation, they could at least stand without fighting for balance. "Almost there," Miles shouted over the wind, his voice barely audible despite their proximity. "The entrance is just ahead." Saren nodded, too exhausted to speak, concentrating on keeping Ariel moving. The boy was stumbling now, his energy flagging. She could see Miles's concern as he registered this, the way he increased his pace despite the difficulty of the terrain. The entrance to the secondary shelter was all but invisible, a small, unremarkable opening in the rock that might have been mistaken for a shadow if one didn't know what to look for. Miles ushered them inside, then sealed the entrance behind them with a heavy metal panel that appeared to have been salvaged from colony equipment. The space beyond was as Miles had described, small, utilitarian, barely large enough for the three of them. But it was secure, protected from the wind and snow by the solid rock that surrounded it on all sides. A small, battery-powered heater sat in one corner, and Miles activated it immediately, the faint glow of its heating elements providing the only light in the darkness. "Are you both all right?" he asked, his voice rough with exertion and concern. "Cold," Ariel mumbled, his teeth chattering so hard the word was barely intelligible. "So cold." Saren pulled her son close, feeling the chill of his small body, even through the layers of their thermal suits. "His temperature is dropping too fast," she said to Miles, fear tightening her throat. "He needs more heat." Miles nodded, already stripping off his outer layer despite the cold. "Body heat," he said tersely. "It's all we have until the shelter warms up." They created a nest of sorts from their combined outer garments, huddling together with Ariel between them, their bodies forming a protective cocoon around the child. Gradually, as their combined warmth began to penetrate the chill, Ariel's shivering subsided, his breathing becoming more regular. "Will the storm find us here?" he asked drowsily, the question reflecting a child's personification of the natural forces that threaten them. "No," Miles assured him, his voice gentle. "We're safe here. The storm can't get through the rock." Ariel seemed satisfied with this answer, his eyes drifting closed as exhaustion claimed him. Soon, his breathing deepened into sleep, his body relaxing as the immediate danger passed. Saren met Miles's gaze over Ariel's sleeping form, the intimacy of their position, pressed together in the small space, sharing warmth, sharing breath, suddenly acute. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for what she felt. "For knowing this was here. For getting us out in time." Miles shook his head slightly, dismissing the gratitude. "I should have moved us sooner," he said, the self-recrimination clear in his tone. "I knew the shelter was compromised. I just thought we had more time." "We're alive," Saren pointed out. "That's what matters." Miles was silent for a moment, his gaze dropping to Ariel. "Yes," he agreed softly. "That's what matters." They remained like that through the long hours of the night, listening to the storm rage outside, taking comfort in the simple fact of each other's presence, of continued survival against all odds. At some point, Saren found herself drifting towards sleep, her head coming to rest against Miles's shoulder, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the feeling of Miles's arm tightening around both her and Ariel, drawing them closer, as if he could protect them from the world through sheer force of will. And in that moment, despite the cold, despite the danger that still surrounded them, despite the uncertainty of their future, Saren felt something she had thought lost forever: safe. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, confining them to the tiny secondary shelter. They rationed their supplies carefully, melting snow for water, taking turns at the small viewport to monitor the storm's progress. Ariel, adaptable as only children can be, made a game of their confinement, declaring the shelter a spacecraft and themselves explorers of distant galaxies. Miles, to Saren's surprise, entered into the game with unexpected enthusiasm, crafting elaborate stories about the planets they were discovering, complete with strange creatures and dramatic perils. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, playful, imaginative, gentle in a way that made her heart ache with an emotion she was finally ready to name. When the storm finally subsided, leaving behind a transformed landscape of smooth, undulating snowdrifts and strange, wind-carved formations, they emerged cautiously into the blinding brightness of a clear day. The air was preternaturally still after the violence of the blizzard, the silence so complete it seemed to ring in their ears. "Will the vehicles still be there?" Saren asked as they made their way carefully back toward the primary shelter, following the path Miles had marked with notches in the rock face. "If we're lucky," Miles replied, his expression guarded. "If not, we start over. Rebuild what we can." But luck, it seemed, was finally on their side. The vehicle was intact, protected by its position in the lee of a rocky outcropping. The primary shelter had not fared as well. The section that had begun to fail during the storm had collapsed completely, rendering the space uninhabitable. "We'll salvage what we can," Miles decided, surveying the damage. "Load it into the vehicle. The secondary shelter can be our base until we're ready to make the journey to the northern outpost." The work was hard, complicated by the need to dig through snow and ice to reach items buried in the collapse. But they worked together with the efficiency of a team long accustomed to each other's rhythms. Ariel helped in his way, his small hands often able to reach into spaces the adults couldn't access. It took 3 days to salvage everything of value, to repair the minor damage the vehicle had sustained, to plot the most efficient route to the northern outpost. And then, on the morning of the 4th day, they were ready. "Are you sure about this?" Saren asked Miles as they loaded the last of their supplies into the vehicle. "If the transmitter doesn't work, if no one hears us, then we try something else," Miles said simply. "We keep going. Together." The certainty in his voice, the implicit promise of continued partnership regardless of outcome, settled something in Saren that had been restless, anxious. She nodded, accepting his answer, accepting the future it implied. Ariel was practically vibrating with excitement as they boarded the vehicle, claiming the small jump seat behind the main console as his own. "Will we see the ice grazers?" he asked, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Will there be other people at the big machine?" "We might see ice grazers," Miles told him, initiating the vehicle's startup sequence. "As for people, I don't know, buddy. It's been a long time since anyone was stationed there. The journey was slower than they had hoped, the vehicle's progress hampered by the altered terrain left in the blizzard's wake. What should have been a day's travel stretched into 2, then 3, as they carefully navigated around obstacles, backtracked from impassable areas, and stopped periodically to let the vehicle's systems cool down. But finally, as the sun began to set on the 3rd day, the northern outpost came into view, a low, bunker-like structure nestled against a cliff face, partially obscured by drifting snow. Unlike the main colony, which had been designed with aesthetics in mind, the outpost was purely functional, built to withstand the planet's harsh conditions rather than to impress visiting dignitaries. "It doesn't look like the big machine," Ariel said, disappointment evident in his voice. "The transmitter is inside," Miles explained, bringing the vehicle to a stop at a safe distance from the outpost. "We need to be careful now. Wait here while I check to make sure it's secure." "I'll come with you," Saren said immediately, unwilling to let him face potential danger alone. Miles looked as though he might argue, then nodded, recognizing the determination in her eyes. "Stay close," he said. Then, to Ariel, "We'll be right back. Don't touch any of the controls." "Understand." Ariel nodded solemnly, though his attention was already shifting to the viewports, scanning the surroundings for any sign of the ice grazers he was so fascinated by. Saren and Miles approached the outpost cautiously, weapons ready, alert for any sign of recent activity. But the entrance was as Miles had left it nearly a year ago, secured with a locking mechanism of his own design, undisturbed by human hands. "Looks clear," he said, disengaging the lock. "But stay sharp. Things could have changed inside." The interior of the outpost was cold and dark, illuminated only by the fading daylight that filtered through small, reinforced windows. Miles activated a portable light, sweeping its beam across equipment covered in a thin layer of dust, chairs pushed neatly under consoles, a small kitchenette area with cups still sitting on a counter, as if the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment rather than evacuated over a year ago. "Power's out," Miles noted, moving toward a large panel on the far wall. "But there should be emergency generators." He worked quickly, his hands sure despite the time that had passed since he had last been here. After a few minutes, there was a low hum, and emergency lights flickered to life, casting the space in a dim, bluish glow. "The transmitter?" Saren asked, eager to confirm whether their journey had been worthwhile. Miles moved to another console, this one larger than the others, dominated by a complex array of switches, dials, and screens. He studied it intently, then began a methodical process of activation, each step performed with careful precision. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then, with a whine that rose in pitch until it was nearly inaudible, the console came to life. Lights flickered across its surface, and one of the screens illuminated, displaying a series of diagnostic messages. "It's working," Miles said, the relief in his voice palpable. "The power reserves are low, but it's working. Now we need to boost the signal with the components from the mercenaries' vehicle." The next few hours were a blur of focused activity. Saren retrieved Ariel from the vehicle, and they set about making the outpost habitable, clearing dust, activating the environmental systems, preparing a simple meal from their supplies. Miles worked on the transmitter, integrating the salvage components, making adjustments, testing signal strength. As night fell, casting the world outside into darkness, he finally stepped back from the console, exhaustion etched in every line of his face but satisfaction glowing in his eyes. "It's done," he said. "The signal is broadcasting on all emergency frequencies. If there's anyone within range, they'll hear it." "And if they do?" Saren asked, voicing the question that had haunted her for months. "If someone comes, what then?" Miles moved to where she stood at the outpost's viewport, Ariel asleep in a makeshift bed nearby. He stood, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, a now familiar comfort in this cold world. "Then we have choices," he said quietly. "We can go back to the inner systems, find a place there, or we can request placement on a frontier world, somewhere the corporation has less influence. Somewhere Ariel can grow up with more than just ice and survival lessons." He paused, then added, more softly still, somewhere we can find out what we could be away from all this. Saren turned to face him, struck by the echo of their earlier conversation, by the fact that he had remembered not just the substance, but the exact words. "And if no one comes?" she asked, though she already knew his answer. "Then we keep going," Miles said simply. "We survive. Together." His hand found hers in the dim light, fingers intertwining with familiar ease. "But I think someone will come. I have to believe that. For Ariel's sake. For ours." Saren nodded, allowing herself to share in his cautious hope. She leaned into him slightly, her head coming to rest against his shoulder, their joined hands a bridge between their bodies. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, cold and distant, but somehow less remote than they had seemed before. The transmitter hummed behind them, sending its message out into the vast darkness. And between them, the warmth they had created, not just the physical heat of bodies in proximity, but something deeper, more enduring, persisted, a defiance of the cold that had very nearly claimed them both. In that moment, Saren understood the true nature of the miracle that had occurred on that desperate night when she had wrapped Ariel in her arms and closed her eyes, accepting death as inevitable. It wasn't just that Miles had found them, had brought them back from the edge of death. It was that in doing so, he had given them something beyond mere survival. A connection, a purpose, a reason to keep fighting when surrender would have been easier. "I think someone will come too," she said softly, and felt Miles's arm tighten around her in response. They stood together at the viewport, watching the stars, waiting for a sign, from the universe, from potential rescuers, from each other, that the future they dared to imagine might actually be possible. And as the night deepened around them, as Ariel slept peacefully nearby, as the transmitter continued its steady broadcast into the darkness, Saren allowed herself to believe, truly believe, that they would find that future, no matter how long it took, no matter what obstacles still lay ahead. For they had already overcome the greatest obstacle of all, the cold emptiness of a world that cared nothing for human suffering or human hope. And they had done it the only way possible, together, sharing what warmth they had, refusing to surrender to the darkness, each becoming, for the others, a light to guide the way home.